At my late husband's funeral, his mistress showed up. I knew exactly what to do when they read the will. The small porcelain bird, a robin with a chipped wing, sat on the mantelpiece for 53 years. It was a wedding gift from his mother, a woman who never quite looked me in the eye. I remember the day it arrived, carefully unwrapped from tissue paper and placed with an almost sacred reverence by his hand. He'd smiled, a quick, almost imperceptible twitch of his lips that didn't quite reach his eyes. Even then, at 22, I noticed it. It was the first fracture, a tiny hairline crack in the carefully painted surface of our life, and only I saw it. If this sounds like your silence, stay. You don't owe them your forgiveness, not anymore. And if you know a woman who carried too much for too long, give her this story. He was always particular about that bird. Every Saturday when I dusted, he'd watch not me but the movement of my hand around it, as if a single wrong touch might shatter it. It never moved from that spot, never. Through 2 children, 3 homes, countless arguments we never had, and all the years he spent elsewhere, it remained a silent sentinel to a life he was building, or perhaps unbuilding, without me. And for a second, no one said a word. The funeral, of course, was exactly what he would have wanted, a proper affair. Just enough grief to be respectable, just enough praise to elevate him to something he never truly was. People spoke of his generosity, his sharp mind, his quiet strength. I listened, my hands clasped in my lap, feeling the cool weight of my wedding band. It had grown a little loose over the years. You call it tradition, but I was the only one bleeding from it. And then she walked in. Head high, a discreet black dress, but her eyes were too bright, too knowing, too present. She sat in the 3rd row, just behind his sister, a place too close for a stranger, too far for family. Everyone whispered, of course. Not to me, never to me, but around me like a hushed current in the room. I felt their eyes not on her, but on me, waiting for a reaction. Expecting one. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. I simply watched her face, the way she clutched a small, crumpled handkerchief. It was a familiar pattern, this expectation that I would break, that I would unravel in front of them all. They'd seen it before in smaller ways, over smaller slights, always hoping for a show. But I had run out of tears for him a long time ago. My well had dried up, leaving only a quiet, resolute stillness. And for a second, no one said a word. The will reading was set for 2 days later at the lawyer's office. I arrived first, of course. Punctual, always punctual. Our children, now grown, sat on either side of me, their faces grim, a mixture of their father's stoicism and my own quiet hurt. Then she walked in again, this time with a woman I recognized as her sister, a small, dark-haired woman I'd seen him with once, long ago, in a restaurant. They sat across from us, the unspoken chasm between our 2 tables as wide and deep as a lifetime. The lawyer, a nervous man with thinning hair, cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. He began to read, his voice droning a monotonous recitation of assets and beneficiaries. Land investments, the summer house he'd always promised we'd retire to. My children shifted, their eyes darting between me and her. You call it family, but I was the only one holding the shattered pieces. He spoke of me first, of course, as his devoted wife, leaving me the house, the primary accounts, all the things that would ensure my comfort. A small sigh of relief, almost imperceptible, passed through my children. Then he spoke of them, of his children, his legacy, each receiving a generous sum enough to set them up for life. They nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of their inheritance. And then the lawyer paused, took a sip of water. He looked at the mistress, a fleeting glance, and then back at the document. This was it, the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment for me to finally truly break. The lawyer's voice, when he resumed, was a little softer, a little more hesitant. He began to read a new clause, one that no one, not even my children, had anticipated. To Miss Eleanor Vance? My husband's mistress stiffened her hand, still clutching the handkerchief, but her eyes for the first time held a flicker of something akin to hope. She leaned forward just slightly, her sister beside her, mirroring the movement. The air in the room seemed to thicken, every breath held. And for a second, no one said a word. The lawyer continued, his words slow and deliberate. I bequeath the sum of $5,000 to be used for the upkeep and maintenance of the small porcelain robin with the chipped wing currently residing on the mantelpiece of my former residence for the duration of her natural life. It is my express wish that she ensures its continued presence in a place of prominence undisturbed. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, it was a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room. My children looked at me then, at her, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. The mistress, Eleanor, stared at the lawyer, her mouth slightly agape. the hope in her eyes replaced by a bewildered shock. $5,000 for a chipped bird. It was nothing. A pittance. An insult dressed as a legacy. You call it love, but I was the only one who saw the strings attached to every single breath. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I simply watched her face the slow, dawning realization of what he had done. It wasn't about the money. It was about the bird. The silent, chipped bird that had sat on our mantelpiece for over half a century. The bird I had dusted every Saturday. The bird he had watched me clean with such peculiar intensity. He had left her a burden, a meaningless, insignificant burden attached to a paltry sum and a lifetime of obligation to a fragile, broken object. An object that symbolized nothing to her and everything in its quiet, chipped way to me. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. Her sister, sensing the subtle cruelty, reached out and gently touched Eleanor's arm. Eleanor's face, which had been so composed at the funeral, so confidently present, began to crumple. Not with grief, but with a raw, undeniable humiliation. It was a public acknowledgement of her true place in his life, not as a cherished confidant, not as a second family, but as a caretaker for a chipped porcelain trinket. An afterthought, a footnote tied to a meaningless symbol of my life with him. And for a second, no one said a word. The lawyer cleared his throat again, his discomfort palpable. He quickly moved on to the executor's duties, to the closing statements, eager to escape the suffocating weight of the unspoken. But the air in the room remained charged, thrumming with the quiet shock of what had just transpired. My children exchanged glances, a dawning understanding in their eyes. They had known parts of him, aspects he had allowed them to see. But this subtle, calculated cruelty, cloaked in a bizarre bequest, was a side they had never witnessed. You call it legacy, but I was the only one who understood the silent language of his contempt. Eleanor rose abruptly, pushing her chair back with a scrape that echoed in the quiet room. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin white line. Without a word, without a glance at me or my children, she walked out, her sister hurrying after her. The door clicked shut, leaving only the lawyer, my children, and me in the room. The silence that followed her departure was different. It was lighter, clearer, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. My daughter, always the more expressive of the two, leaned over and whispered, "Mother, what was that?" I simply looked at her, then at my son, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching my lips. The porcelain bird. He had cared about it, certainly, but not for its beauty or its sentimentality. He had cared about it because it was a constant, tiny reminder of my domesticity. My predictable presence, my unwavering care, even as he built a secret life. And in the end, he had made her responsible for it too. A perpetual meaningless task, a quiet daily humiliation. It was his final word, and it wasn't for me. My son, ever practical, just nodded slowly. He didn't ask what it meant. He didn't have to. The air was thick with the unsaid, and for once it wasn't my burden to carry. I looked at the lawyer, who was meticulously gathering his papers, clearly eager to conclude this awkward family drama. "Thank you," I said, my voice calm, steady. "That will be all." And for a second, no one said a word. We left the office, the three of us stepping out into the late afternoon sun. The world outside felt oddly crisp, sharply defined, as if a long-held fog had finally lifted. My children walked on either side of me, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt their hands not just touching mine, but truly holding on. It wasn't pity I felt from them, or even sympathy, but a new kind of understanding. A quiet acknowledgement of the unseen burdens I had carried, the silent battles I had fought in a life that from the outside had appeared perfectly ordinary. You call it peace, but I was the only one who tasted the bitter residue of what was left behind. We drove home in silence, a comfortable, shared silence that felt different from the years of unspoken words that had filled our home. The house felt the same, yet subtly altered. Lighter. I walked directly to the mantelpiece, my eyes falling on the small porcelain robin. Its chipped wing, a small imperfection, suddenly seemed less like a flaw and more like a testament, a mark of survival, of endurance. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. I picked it up, something I hadn't done in years. It was lighter than I remembered, cool and smooth beneath my fingers. I turned it over, examining the tiny crack in its porcelain. It was just a bird, an object. Yet for so long it had been a silent witness to a life he'd compartmentalized, a constant reminder of the carefully constructed facade he had presented to the world and to me. And now he had tried to make it her burden, his final pathetic attempt at control even from beyond the grave. And for a second, no one said a word. I carried the bird into the kitchen, my children watching me, still silent, still curious. They had never seen me handle it, not like this. I walked to the rubbish bin beneath the sink, lifted the lid, and without a moment's hesitation, I dropped the porcelain robin inside. It landed with a dull clink against the plastic, a tiny, insignificant sound that was swallowed by the quiet hum of the refrigerator. My children gasped, a soft, simultaneous intake of breath. Their eyes were wide, incredulous. "Mother," my daughter exclaimed, "what did you do?" My son, ever the calm one, simply stared at the bin, then at me. I looked at them, my heart feeling clear, light, unburdened. "You call it property, but I was the only one who knew the true value of releasing what was never truly mine. It was just a bird," I said, my voice steady, "and it served its purpose." I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to. The purpose finally was complete. The quiet justice served not with anger, but with the cool, calm clarity of a woman who had simply waited long enough. The weight of his expectations, his manipulations, his silent cruelties, it had all settled finally, not on me, and certainly not on her, but in the forgotten depths of a rubbish bin. My daughter, the initial shock fading, slowly began to smile. It was a slow, dawning realization, a quiet understanding passing between us. My son, too, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, nodded. They finally saw it, not the anger, not the bitterness, but the simple surgical act of detachment. The severing of a tie that had bound me for too long, not to him, but to the performance of a role he'd assigned me. And for a second, no one said a word. The house, once filled with the ghosts of his expectations, felt lighter, less stifling. I walked through the rooms, the familiar furniture, the worn carpets, and saw them not as remnants of a shared life, but as objects I now chose to inhabit. There was no grand gesture, needed no dramatic declaration. The quiet click of a bin lid was enough, the simple act of discarding a meaningless symbol. You call it burden, but I was the only one who truly understood the freedom in letting go. The calls came, of course, from family, from friends, from those who felt entitled to an explanation for Eleanor's abrupt departure from the will reading. I offered none. It was his wish, I would say, my voice calm, unwavering, and it was carried out. There was no need to elaborate, no need to justify. The narrative they had constructed around him and around me was no longer mine to uphold. I didn't hurt them, I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. Life continued as it always does. The seasons turned, the days lengthened and shortened. I found a quiet rhythm, a peace that had eluded me for decades. The silence in the house was no longer heavy with unspoken words, but light with my own thoughts, my own choices. I read more, I walked more, I rediscovered hobbies I had long set aside. There was a quiet hum of contentment, a subtle shift in the very air I breathed. And for a second, no one said a word. The robin, chipped and forgotten in the bin, was just a small, almost invisible piece of a larger mosaic. But sometimes it's the smallest fracture that reveals the greatest truth. The truth of a life lived for others, a self-erasure so gradual it was barely perceptible. And the truth of the quiet, deliberate undoing of that erasure. I didn't rebuild my life. I simply stepped into the one that had been waiting for me all along, unburdened by the weight of someone else's expectations. You call it old age, but I finally understood that true wisdom is knowing what to discard. I still dusted the mantelpiece every Saturday, but my hand moved freely, without the watchful gaze, without the careful reverence for a broken thing. The empty space where the robin had sat was not a void, but an opening. A quiet affirmation of a truth finally acknowledged that some things, some people, no matter how long they've been there, are simply not meant to be kept. The years since have been gentle, not empty but filled with a quiet fullness that comes from finally living for oneself. My children visit often, and our conversations are richer now, stripped of the old pretenses. They don't mention the bird or Eleanor or him, not anymore. But sometimes when they look at me, I see a glimmer of understanding, a quiet respect for the choices I've made, the peace I've found. And for a second, no one said a word. I still wear my wedding ring. It's not a symbol of devotion anymore, but of endurance, of having walked through fire and emerged not unscathed, but undeniably whole. It's a reminder that a life can be quietly reclaimed even after decades of quiet forfeiture. There are no grand epiphanies, no cinematic moments of triumph. Just the steady, unyielding hum of being finally, truly myself. You call it memory, but I finally understood that some stories are best rewritten not with anger, but with silence. I walk in my garden now, tending to the roses, feeling the sun on my skin. The earth beneath my hands is cool and yielding, much like my own spirit has become. I don't seek revenge. I don't seek anything really beyond the simple pleasure of each day. The gentle execution, as I sometimes call it in my quiet thoughts, was not about inflicting pain. It was about severing the last thread of a silent, lifelong burden. It was about finally truly setting myself free. I didn't hurt them. I just finally stopped holding the guilt they gave me. And for a second, no one said a word.